it's important to observe that Paul viewed his conduct as a vital part of his evangelistic strategy. And by that I mean that he viewed his way of life as playing an essential role in reinforcing the message of the gospel that he proclaimed. And so in describing how the gospel came to people, we regularly hear Paul saying things similar to what he says at the end of verse 5. You know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake. You remember how we lived. So it's a statement of their character and their conduct, and it tells us a lot about their evangelistic strategy. They not only presented the gospel, though they did that, they not only presented the gospel, they intentionally lived godly lives among them, and it served to give credibility to their message. The most powerful witness comes when people both hear the gospel proclaimed and see the gospel applied. And so we see in the text, our gospel came to you not only in word, but that was included. You know how we lived among you. Their conduct. That's the type of witness that the Thessalonians were exposed to. And then we see that the Thessalonians then became imitators. Verse 6, and you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit. So they became imitators of their conduct by meeting affliction with joy. They also became examples through their endurance. They became examples through their work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope. And it is because of all these things that the word of the Lord was then sounding forth so loudly from them. And their testimony was going forth as well, and they were able to be an example to other congregations. They received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit. What trial are you facing today? What trial have you faced this week? Are you weighed down with much affliction, with sickness, with financial pressure, with relational difficulties? I want to encourage you to not grow bitter in your suffering, in your affliction, to not grow disillusioned, to not grow depressed as people so often do in their suffering. Rather pray that God gives you the grace to respond with the joy of the Holy Spirit. Joy is a fruit of the Spirit of God in our lives. And the trials in our lives, the trial that's presently in your life, as difficult as it may be, is providing you, as it provided these believers, with an opportunity to be an example to others and to create a base that is mature and healthy and is then effectively sounding forth the word of the Lord. So the way to have a Thessalonian-like influence in the world is through an exemplary way of life. In the 19th century, London had become the most important city in the world. There was a church that was in London, Metropolitan Tabernacle. Has to rank among the most evangelistic and influential churches in history. The pastor's name at the Metropolitan Tabernacle was Charles Spurgeon. Yep, so Charles Spurgeon ministered there. Do you know why the word of the Lord rang out so loudly and persuasively through London in the 19th century? It wasn't just Spurgeon. As powerful a preacher as he was, Spurgeon would point to the grace of God in a model congregation. He considered their way of life, their godliness, their example as playing an essential role in the spread of the gospel throughout London. So Spurgeon, in his sermon on this text in 1 Thessalonians 1, read it earlier this week, he says this. Let me read this to you. We'll process it together. This is what he says. till we have more grace in our hearts and more holiness in our lives, we shall lack the greatest means of making the gospel known. Is that right? Till we have more grace in our hearts, more holiness in our lives, we shall lack the greatest means of making the gospel known. How can he say that? The reason Spurgeon could say that is not because he believed that the message of the gospel could be made known apart from the verbal proclamation of the gospel, like preach the gospel at all times, use words if necessary. No. Spurgeon would have had none of it. Words are always necessary to proclaim the gospel, and you can no more communicate the good news of the gospel through your behavior than you can communicate the nightly news through your behavior. The reason Spurgeon could say this is because he understood that the greatest means of making the gospel known is not to speak a message that has had zero effect on our lives and conduct, but rather to have the message spoken by and ring out from and be accompanied with a holy, loving, joyful, exemplary congregation, apart from which you do not have the greatest means of making the gospel known. This is what he saw. You can't leave the holiness of the church out of the equation in our witness. And this is why Spurgeon also said, he said, I believe that one reason why the church of God at this present moment has so little influence over the world is because the world has so much influence over the church. And certainly this is one of the primary reasons the evangelical church in the 21st century America has failed to win more people to the gospel. We have become ineffective in our witness in large part because we have become so much like the world. Do you know what happens when a church becomes immoral? For example, worldliness, complaining, unbiblical divorce, sexual impurity, the egalitarian failure to functionally embrace gender roles, or at times explicitly failing to embrace gender roles, biblical manhood and womanhood. Do you know what happens in any one of those examples? Any one of them will destroy the witness of the church. It will ruin our verbal proclamation of the message of the gospel. The New Testament could not be more clear that the very progress of the gospel is at stake in the conduct of God's people, especially how we relate to each other as believers. So where our lives are divisive and unloving, the gospel is not going to appear credible. It will be reviled. But where relationships are loving and peaceful and where lives truly are being changed, think Thessalonica, the gospel we proclaim then becomes weighty and attractive. Godly conduct will adorn the gospel and crank up the volume of the gospel. Ungodly conduct will silence the sound of the gospel. So look at your life and ask yourself, how is your godliness or lack of it contributing to the witness of Covenant Fellowship Church? Where is it that God is currently showing you where you need to grow in godliness, and how are you pursuing that growth? Those questions matter, and I ask them not just because I want to care for you pastorally, although I do, but also because I want to continue to help us to have a witness increasingly that will serve to advance the gospel that we love.